One of my favorite ideas I learned over the last couple of years is the inner citadel from Isaiah Berlin. Do you know this?
Mm-hmm.
So Isaiah Berlin says, when the natural road toward human fulfillment is blocked, human beings retreat into themselves, become involved in themselves, and try to create inwardly that world which some evil fate has denied them externally.
That's a delusion often.
If you cannot obtain from the world that which you really desire, you must teach yourself not to want it. If you cannot get what you want, you must teach yourself to want what you can get.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very frequent form of spiritual retreat in depth into a kind of inner citadel in which you lock yourself up against all of the fearful ills of the world. Mutual friend Rob Henderson explained it in a simpler way. If your leg is wounded, you can try to treat the leg. And if you can't, then you cut the leg off and denounce that the desire for legs is misguided and must be subdued. And I think that we see this everywhere.
Well, okay, so imagine that you lay out a plan and it meets with an impediment and it knocks the slats out from underneath the plan. Okay, now you retreat. Okay, now you have an option when you're retreating, and one option is to construct a world in fantasy where you're taking revenge on those who wronged you and getting what you want. That's a pathway to madness. So often people who develop serious delusions do develop, what would you call them? They're compensatory fantasies, and then they start to dwell in them, and often for hundreds of hours. So the kids, again, who shot up the Columbine High School, they dwelt in a fantasy world for hundreds of hours before they undertook their dreadful actions, right? But you can also flip back into yourself, let's say, and you can, this is like confession and atonement. It's the proper way to think about it, is you can think about what it is that you did wrong or insufficiently that led to the collapse of your plan, right? So that's the first investigation. I made some sacrifices. I attempted to bring about a particular form of the future. It didn't happen. Okay, why? Well, the world is set against me and the cosmos is evil and there's no God and I'm bitter and cynical. That's one potential explanation, right? Poor me, right? And I'm not trying to be flippant about this because sometimes people's dreams are quite realistic and they still fail catastrophically. You know, it can be brutal. You know, maybe you did make a lot of good decisions and you suddenly got ill or someone in your family did and everything went to hell on you. It doesn't have to be because you've done something cardinally foolish that you fail. You know, it's built into the structure of the world. But it doesn't matter. You can also retreat into yourself and you can say something like, all right, I need to retool my conception of strategy, but also potentially my conception of goal. You know, maybe I'm looking in the wrong place. Maybe I have to look somewhere else. And you can open yourself up to a revelation. So there's a gospel statement that's very relevant to this. So Christ tells his followers that if they knock, the door will open. If they ask, they'll receive. And if they seek, they'll find. And so it sounds magical. It sounds like the sort of thing that the new atheists would have a field day with, but that's not a wise interpretation of that saying. The proper interpretation is something more like a recognition of the way thought works. So imagine your plans didn't work out. Okay, now you sit down and you say to yourself, I'd like to know, even if the world was conspiring against me and my failure was 95% the fault of external occurrences and other people, what did I do that wasn't as good as it could have been? And where did I fail to look so that the probability of my failure was higher? Now, to ask that question, you have to want the answer. That's what it means to knock or to ask or to seek. This is no joke. It's like you have to want to know. And it's a very painful thing to do because especially if you had given it your all to the degree you were able, and you have reason to be bitter, you're going to be searching for the errors that you still made. And discovering your own errors is always extremely painful, right? Especially if they're errors that you're in love with. And so you have to be willing to strip yourself down. That's what humility means fundamentally. And then, but the advantage is, this is why it's so useful to listen to people. You might find out where you're stupid. And then you could stop being stupid. And so one of the reasons you confess your sins, let's say, is because you want to discover where you're insufficient. Now, it's painful. You know, it's painful to encounter an impediment in the form of someone else's opinion that might show you where you're blind and ignorant or willfully blind even. But the advantage to that is you can rectify the error. And then as you move forward, you're stronger. One of the things I taught my kids, and I hope at least somewhat successfully, was that you should always ask a stupid question. And that doesn't mean the sort of question that someone who wasn't paying attention would ask. If you're listening to someone and you don't understand what they're saying, and you reveal that, you're revealing your ignorance, and maybe you're in a room full of people and you think you're the only person stupid enough to not get it, which is very rarely the case, by the way. The thing is, though, if you reveal that ignorance to yourself and to the other person, they can rectify it. And if you do that 1,000 times, you're not ignorant anymore. And this is a real pathway to success, too. You see it, you do this because you ask real questions in your podcast. And Rogan does this. Okay, Rogan's always trying to be a little smarter than he already is. And then that works, iterated. Like if you ask 1,000 dumb questions and you listen to the answer, then you know 1,000 things, some of them deep, that you didn't know before. So that's the advantage to searching your soul, let's say, for unrequited sins and attempting to atone. That's not a delusion, right? It's an attempt to set yourself right. It's the opposite of a delusion, even though there can be a fantastical element to it.
Yeah, the conversation around people who try their best, do as many things right as they could, and yet still fall short because the world is random and unfortunate things happen. Happiness, as far as I can see it, sits in the gap between your expectations and reality. But the problem here is that people who have high standards often end up feeling a lack, right? How can people who strive like this avoid feeling despondent at falling short of their own high standards? I've heard you talk about the statue of David saying something like, "You are not all that you could be."
Yeah.
And as soon as you posit an ideal, you begin to compare yourself to that ideal.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's a good question. I mean, the ultimate ideal is also the ultimate judge, because the ultimate ideal is something against which you fall far short. And that might be so painful that you can barely stand it. But then what you do is you two things, I suppose, is you lower the ideal and you raise your estimation of your potential. And what do I mean by lower the ideal? Well, if you're comparing yourself to someone or even to a future self, and the gap is so painful that it paralyzes you, then you've created a dragon that you don't have the tools to master. And so what you have to do is you have to scale the dragon down to size. And you want to scale the dragon down to size until it's a size that you are willing to move toward, however small that is. Now, if you're here and your ideal is here and that gap is unbearable, then you reduce the gap and you reduce the gap. And you're going to have to do that anyways, because you're not going to move from where you are to perfect in one fell swoop, right? There's going to be incremental steps. So you have to fill in that hierarchy of progression with a high enough resolution representation so that you can start to move forward. And then you should be buttressed. There's another gospel comment that's very interesting. It has to do, it's called the Matthew Principle. And the Matthew Principle is, to those who have everything, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. Now, it's brutal because it implies that reality works like this. When you're moving up, you go like this, right? And that's pretty nice. That's a lot better than this. But when you're going down, you go like that, right? It's like downhill, cliff. Okay, so you want to avoid the downhill path. Well, if the uphill path is like this, which is like exponential, let's say, or geometric, then what that means is that it doesn't matter how big the first steps you take uphill are, even if they're trivial, even if they're shameful in their size, because you're so useless, that if you're disciplined in that, you'll speed up extraordinarily rapidly. And so that's the good news, you might say, is that you can take very small steps, even ones that might be shameful in their size, and you have to admit that to yourself. But once you get the ball rolling, it doesn't roll in a linear fashion, it rolls in a geometric fashion. And this is a really good thing to know, because it can take the sting out of the realization of your own stupidity. It's like, everybody has their weak sides, let's say, things they're embarrassed about. When I first started going to the gym, I was like, how old was I? 1985, 23. And I think I weighed 135 pounds and I was 6'1", very, very thin. A 27-inch waist, something like that. And I smoked like mad and I drank too much. Like I wasn't in good shape. The first attempts forward I took in the gym, I went to this swimsercise class. Jesus, it was me and this like really fat guy, young guy, probably not in any worse shape than me, and like 7 old women over 70, and they could outswim me. Like it was pretty damn humiliating. And so I did a semester of that and got myself in somewhat better shape. And then I started to go to the gym to work out, to lift weights. And that was also rough because, you know, I'd be underneath the bloody bench press trying to lift 75 pounds off the rests. And, you know, some muscle-headed bastard would come over and tell me how to do it. And it's like, yeah, thank you. But, you know, it's embarrassing. And lots of times people won't do things like go to the gym because they're so embarrassed about how they look or what sort of shape they're in. And it's a pain to start at the bottom. But you start at the bottom where you're weak. And if you want to rectify what's weak, you have to accept the fact that you're at the bottom and that the first steps are going to be painful. You know, it took me about 3 years, but I stopped smoking and then I stopped drinking and I gained 40 pounds of muscle in like 3.5 years, something like that. I basically had to stop doing that because I had to eat like 6 times a day. It was crazy. But I got a lot more physically confident and a lot more coordinated because working out with dumbbells makes you coordinated, right? Because it exercises all the small ligaments and the tendons. And so my lower body in particular got a lot more coordinated. Then I could dance. So that was better when I was going out dancing because I did a lot of that in graduate school. But the point of all this is if you're going to rectify your weaknesses, you have to admit your insufficiency to your own shame. Now, if the gap between you and your ideal is so great that it paralyzes you, you shrink that, right?
We'll get back to talking to Jordan in 1 minute, but first I need to tell you about Element. I've used Element every single morning for over 3 years now. It is the way I start every single day. It tastes fantastic. It optimizes my hydration. It helps to regulate my appetite, and it improves my brain health. Element contains a science-backed electrolyte ratio of sodium, potassium, and magnesium. Best of all, they've got a brand new chocolate caramel flavor, which you can have hot. Hot Element, I hear you say. What sort of hydration blasphemy is this? But no, it tastes fantastic, and on cold mornings, it's perfect. There is a no BS, no questions asked refund policy, so you can buy it and try it completely risk-free. And if you do not like it for any reason, they will give you your money back, and you don't even need to return the box. I've used this every single morning for as long as I can remember, and that orange flavor is phenomenal. Plus, that chocolate caramel is available right now. If you go to the link in the show notes below or head to drinklmnt.com/modernwisdom for a free sample pack of all 8 flavors with your first box. That's drinklmnt.com/modernwisdom. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that clip with Jordan, you will love the over 3-hour-long podcast episode, which is available right here. Go on. Give it a tap.